All right, welcome to the second of this two-part video on African American Vernacular English. In the first video, 36A, we talked about theories about the origins of AAVE, as well as its history of its spread, and a very, very schematic overview of the history of the speech community and how African American Vernacular English spread from the South to places like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Los Angeles. And in this video, we're going to focus on the features of the language itself. I will not be performing AAVE for you in this video any more than I have to, just to demonstrate some of the phonological features. You can find plenty of examples of Black English in American media, including music, but also in such television shows as Insecure on HBO Max, and many, many other shows, to be honest. So, just look around. So yeah, 8 distinctive features of Black English AAVE. For one thing, there is a devoicing of voice stops in stressed syllables, as in bit for bid, right? And sometimes there's a final consonant lost, like if somebody say, loud, they might say lout. That's lout. And then the final T gets dropped already. Like, don't be so loud. So there's a reduction of final consonant clusters when followed by a word beginning with a vowel. So instead of lift up, you get lift up. And instead of busting, you get bussing. This is something you find also in Southern English. There are a lot of similarities between Southern English and African American Vernacular English. And part of the reason for this is because those speech communities were overlapping in the South for a very long time and continue to be. And there's an influence of perhaps on Black English of white Southern English and perhaps on white Southern English of Black English. There's been a lot of theories that a lot of the distinctive features of Southern English come from African American English because a lot of times people working in the households raising children were Black, and it affected the way that white people grew up speaking. Another distinctive feature of AAVE is the absence of plural S. So instead of how many eggs you got, you say how many egg you got. And also the lack of the possessive S. Like instead of saying, he's Terry's cousin, you'll say instead of saying he's Terry's cousin, an AAV speaker might say he Terry cousin, right? And this is just an elaboration of the inflection loss that's been going on in English for 8 centuries with its increasingly analytic nature. Another 4 features of African American Vernacular English, and this is a really incomplete list, but these are just some sort of striking features to speakers of Standard English. What was that? That includes the lack of S in the third person singular. So instead of he walks, he walk. We also have a number of distinctive features, especially in the verb system of African American Vernacular English. This is where it diverges most strongly from Standard English. We have this stressed been, which marks an action or state that took place or began in a long ago remote time and is still relevant. Like, I've been knowing this, and this is an aspectual marker. Aspect is the feature of a verb that tells you not when the action took place or who did it, but how often it took place and how long it happened for. So in Standard English, for example, the difference between, I saw him and I was seeing him is a difference in aspect. There's an absence also in Black English of the present tense copula. And so instead of having to say she is nice, you can say she nice. A lot of languages drop copulas. Italian does, Arabic does, and a lot of the West African languages like Hausa and Yoruba drop the copula, the is verb, the linking verb. And this is a feature of Black English that may possibly come from African languages. Another feature of Black English is the habitual be, where he be working means that he has a job, as opposed to he working, which means, he is currently at work. Let's just take a look a little bit more closely at the very complicated aspectual system of African American vernacular English. And there's a link on this slide here too, as well, to the Garfield Messenger, which dives much more deeply into the aspectual system. But for example, there is a habitual continuative aspect, which describes something that happens a lot and continues to happen. He be working Tuesdays. He works frequently or habitually on Tuesdays. The intensified continuative, he stay working. He is always working. Intensified continuative, not habitual. He's steady working. He keeps on working. The perfect progressive, he'd been working, which means he has been working, and it's been happening for a while. And that just doesn't mean today, but it means in African American English that he's had his job for a while. And then there's this irrealis, this kind of, this represents like hope or intention. He finna go to work. He is about to go to work. And this is just some of the examples of the very precise ways in which African American vernacular English describes action through the way that it combines verbs with various auxiliaries. These are not random. If you use these wrong, you will confuse an African American vernacular English speaker, because it is a language, it is systematic, it is as rule governed as any other language. But these are rules that are often, almost always, not known by white speakers who haven't made a special study of it, or, in some cases, some white speakers have grown up in Black communities where they've kind of intuited these rules through exposure. There's a lot more to say about AAVE. This is not a deep dive. This is actually a shallow dive. But let's talk not about the grammar, but about some of the cultural aspects of African American vernacular English. Central to the kind of linguistic culture of African Americans is in the oral tradition embodied by preaching and oratory, which is to say speech giving. There is a musical and an auditory quality to Black speech that has its origins in African culture. That includes modes of storytelling, rhythms of speech. There's a lot of anaphora, which is to say repeating the beginning of a line, like, for example, the I have a dream speech is that anaphora quality, of repeating the beginning line. It's a poetic device as well, which gives things a certain rhythm. There is a narrative, there are storytelling features, and there's qualities of alliteration to Black speech making as well that has that is very kind of formal and developed and is part of a tradition. Part of the tradition of Black preaching and speech giving as well is the tradition of audience participation. People, shouting "testify" or whatever, or actually, I've and are contributions of Black English to American English. And so that participation, which is by white people who are unfamiliar with this cultural practice, might seem rude or out of order. This is in fact considered appropriate and expected in this speech community. And again, this is something that has origins that go all the way back to African culture, and specifically the West African people that from which our African American people were taken. There's a wonderful video here that I've linked about a number of the continuities between African American speech culture and linguistic culture and its African origins that were enumerated by Henry Louis Gates here, an African American studies professor at Harvard, in his wonderful book, The Signifying Monkey, that go back to the experience of being taken from Africa and the experience of having to speak in code to conceal communications from the surveilling eye of slavers. The riddles and codes and slang that was not meant to be understood by the colonizer. This is really worth your time. Check it out. Another aspect of Black English linguistic culture is the ritual exchange of insults that is sometimes called the dozens. This is not unique to Black English culture, of course. In medieval English and Scottish literature, we have this exchange of insults called flyting, Flyting. You'll find it in Beowulf, in the exchange between Beowulf and Unferth at the palace of Hrothgar at the beginning of that poem. And you'll find it in many, many other Old English and Old Scottish poems, as well as Old Norse. But it's kind of a demonstration of verbal prowess, right? This exchange of insults. African American vernacular English has... obviously, it is because it is the language of a speech community that has been oppressed by racism. It is a stigmatized language. That is to say that those who speak it, Irving Goffman, the sociologist, defined stigma as a reduction in credibility. Somebody who has a stigmatized identity is less likely to be believed. And this connects to Kimberly Crenshaw's development of the idea of intersectionality when she talked about how in legal cases, critical race theory comes out of legal studies. And Crenshaw, who developed the idea of intersectionality, talked about the propensity of juries to believe witnesses. And Black women were the least likely to be believed just on the basis of their identity. Black men would be marginally more believable. And Goffman spoke about stigma as reducing your credibility, so that somebody who is, a woman or disabled or, openly gay or something like that, very traditionally would not be given credence by legal institutions, by the sort of general public, as much as somebody who is in a less stigmatized identity. And so the language spoken by many Black, but not all Black people, not all African Americans speak AAVE. This is important to remember as well. It's also important to remember that there's a continuum between, I think I talked about this in the last video, but there's a continuum between, standard English and full-on AAVE as spoken by, say, people who have lived their whole life pretty much isolated within a AAVE speech community, like in rural Mississippi or the south side of Chicago, where they've mostly only ever heard other people speaking Black English. And so, and if you as a white person were to go into that community, and you wouldn't understand those people at all, but Black people who have to interact with white people or choose to more, there's a kind of slider that they can move between, it's not code switching isn't just, a flip flop, it's a slider, right? So that somebody can, on the one end, there is deep Ebonics, you might call it, that is virtually unintelligible to a white person with no experience of it. And on the other end, there's like standard American English, and you move off that slider and it's standard American English spoken with like a Black accent, so to speak. But varying degrees of stigma is attached to the Black accent in our American culture. One sort of manifestation of this was the so-called Ebonics controversy of 1997, where the School Board of Oakland, using ideas that came out of linguistic research, decided that it would be more effective for Black students who grew up in AAVE speech communities to have their primary language, which they refer to as Ebonics, a term that comes from a linguist in the early 1970s and has been used variously, or used to be used more interchangeably with African American vernacular English until the term itself became attached to and almost representative of the stigma attached to Black English. But in large part because of this controversy. Anyway, they wanted to teach Black students using Black English. And not just so that they would only speak Black English, but as a way into learning standard American English in a way that was easier and more effective. Imagine if you're a white person going into a classroom where the teacher and everybody is speaking in deep African American vernacular English. You're a kindergartner. You have no idea what they're saying. Nobody around you has ever spoken like this before, and you're treated like you're incapable or unintelligent because you don't understand what they're saying. The idea was to sort of ease people in and to basically bilingually educate them so that they could better and more quickly master standard English, which in our American society gives you access to better jobs, education, so on and so forth, and gives you the opportunity to speak in certain situations in a way where you won't have that stigma attached to you. Now, when this was picked up by the press and kind of circulated nationally, people just freaked right out. There was a kind of panic about this, that, oh my goodness, they're teaching children, they're going to teach children to talk like, and I'll use terms here that are associated with racism here, but the idea was that they were going to teach people to talk ghetto, right? And that they were going to speak this degenerate, stigmatized form of English, and that this was going to be this was lazy, and it was bad, and it was all kinds of problems, and people didn't really understand what the purpose or goal of this was. And the community, the American Black community was also divided over this. Is this advertisement in a major Black magazine, I think it was Ebony or something, that was published by the United Negro College Fund, I think, sort of lampooning the idea of using AAVE to teach by superimposing this AAVE rephrasing of Martin Luther King's speech over this image of Martin Luther King himself. So this idea that Oakland had never really took off. It was never really tried out. And this really is a kind of, I think, index of the sort of stigma and the distaste that's attached to Black English by many Americans, Black and white. It is a fact. Nevertheless, Black English has had a huge effect on standard American English, particularly the vernacular, the way people speak. American English is hard to imagine without Black English. So we can ask a few questions. Why does a basilect survive? Why does a language variety that is associated with people in a lower class who are heavily stigmatized, why does it survive and continue? That is one of our discussion topics this week. But another question is, why is African American vernacular English such a rich source of borrowing for standard English speakers, especially in the U.S.? Is this expropriation stealing? I have no definitive answers on this, but I will just give you an example of all the words from going back. Cool. You might not know that cool comes from Black English decades and decades and decades ago, and groovy. And more recently, in my youth in the 90s, calling something the bomb, right? Came out of hip hop lingo, and holla, YOLO, twerk, bay, trap queen, ratchet, squad, fleek. God, I'm making myself cringe so hard saying these out loud right now. Fleek, yas, basic, shade, swag, riz. That's a new one that I just added to this slide. Drip and steez. All of these come from Black English. Social media, as this graphic implies, although Twitter is no longer the main vector now, I think it's TikTok, but social media has become a vector of borrowing Black English by white people, and to what extent is this expropriation? To what extent is this something that's just always been happening? Why is it that white people don't invent so much slang itself? What is this, the prestige, the glamour, the kind of sexiness that is attached to Black English that white people want, at the same time as Black English is considered to be but by reflex, so inferior? These are really complicated questions. There's a lot that's been written on them, both by liberal and conservative commentators. A very interesting, controversial conservative Black writer on these questions is John McWhorter, who's a gifted linguist and a good writer. I don't agree with some of what he says, but I find his ideas very thought-provoking. But yeah, that's it on this two-parter on Black English. That we have barely scratched the surface of this rich topic, but I hope that it has taught you something new that you didn't know before and been thought-provoking for you. And I think the most important thing to take away, especially for teachers, is that Black English, African American Vernacular English, is a language. And it is a language that is systematic, it is rule governed, it is not random or arbitrary or lazy, it is just different. And that those who grew up speaking it, and especially those who did not grow up in bilingual environments where they were interacted with white people a lot, standard American English is a second language. Is it a language that would be easier to learn than, say, Arabic or Uzbek? Probably, because they are closely related languages. Like Scots is closely related too, but it's not the same. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.